If you have driven through Alabama long enough, there is a good chance you have passed through places where entire communities once stood, without slowing down once. A crumbling foundation at the edge of a cotton field, a cemetery with no town around it anymore, a single brick wall standing in the middle of nowhere, with vines pulling it back into the earth. Alabama has more of these places than most people realize, and the stories behind them are more extraordinary than anything the history books bother to include. These are 10 of those places, and most people have never heard of a single one of them. Number 10. Scottsville, Alabama, Limestone County. The last family to leave Scottsville did not leave because of a fire or a flood. They left because there was simply nothing left to stay for. And that quiet, undramatic ending is exactly what makes this town's story worth telling. Scottsville grew up in Limestone County in the early 19th century with genuine ambition: a post office, a cotton gin, several merchants, and the kind of early commercial energy that made settlers believe they were building something permanent. For a time, it really did feel that way. The town's entire economic logic depended on the cotton trade moving through it, and when the railroad came through Limestone County, it chose Athens instead of Scottsville. That single routing decision redirected every commercial force the town had been accumulating. Merchants relocated to follow the traffic, families followed the merchants, the post office closed, the cotton gin sat idle. What remained after the commercial energy drained away was geography. Just land in northern Alabama with no particular reason to organize a community on it anymore. Scottsville did not burn down or flood or collapse dramatically. It simply lost its reason and then ceased to exist, one departure at a time, until the last holdout locked up and left. Almost nothing marks the site today. Number 9. Elton, Alabama, Jefferson County. There is a ghost town sitting directly underneath one of the largest cities in Alabama, and almost nobody who lives in Birmingham today knows it is there. Elton was the original county seat of Jefferson County, established in 1821 with a courthouse, a jail, hotels, law offices, and the full administrative infrastructure of a functioning 19th century Alabama county seat. It was a real town with real institutional weight, the kind of place that assumed its own permanence because courthouses do not get built in places expected to disappear. When the Louisville and Nashville Railroad laid its lines through Jefferson County in 1871, the railroad chose a route that bypassed Elton entirely. The new junction point a few miles away was called Birmingham, and it was incorporated that same year. What happened next was one of the fastest municipal transfers in Alabama history. Birmingham grew with a speed that nobody had anticipated, driven by the extraordinary coincidence of iron ore, coal, and limestone deposits all existing within miles of each other, creating an iron and steel industry that transformed the region almost overnight. Elton, sitting a short distance away without a rail connection, was simply absorbed and then erased by the city that replaced it. The county seat moved to Birmingham in 1873. 2 years later, Elton had effectively ceased to exist as a distinct community. One of Alabama's oldest county seats was swallowed by one of its youngest cities before most of the people who built it had even left. Number 8. Jonesboro, Alabama, Lawrence County. Jonesboro was the original county seat of Lawrence County, and it disappeared for a reason that still feels strange when you understand it fully. The town had everything a functioning Alabama county seat needed in the early 19th century: courthouse, businesses, professional offices, the commercial activity that courthouse traffic generates. People built their lives around its administrative function, with the reasonable expectation that a county seat was as permanent an institution as any community could anchor itself to. In 1820, the Alabama legislature moved the Lawrence County seat to Moulton. The decision was administrative and political, and made in a building far from Jonesboro by people who did not live there. The community that had organized itself around the courthouse function found itself without the one thing that had justified its existence. Businesses relocated to Moulton to follow the legal and commercial traffic. The professional class that courts attract, lawyers, clerks, merchants serving that economy, packed up and moved. The families who depended on that economy followed. Jonesboro did not have a secondary identity to fall back on. No manufacturing, no particular geographic advantage beyond the administrative function it had lost. It simply emptied. The courthouse was gone, and the town went with it. The land it stood on in Lawrence County gives no indication today that a county seat once operated there. Number 7. Bell Factory, Alabama, Madison County. Bell Factory in Madison County has a ghost town story that most Alabama towns cannot claim. It was not killed by a railroad decision or an administrative reorganization. It was killed by a war. And not just killed, it was deliberately destroyed by soldiers who understood exactly what they were doing and why. Bell Factory was a textile mill community that grew up along the Flint River in the antebellum period, producing cotton cloth and employing the workers who lived in the company. Industrial community that the antebellum South built around its manufacturing operations. Complete, functional, and entirely organized around the mill at its center. In 1862, Union cavalry under Colonel John Basil Turchin moved through northern Alabama on a raid that became infamous for its destruction of civilian property. Bell Factory was on the route. The mill was a Confederate manufacturing asset, producing cloth for the Confederate war effort, and Turchin's men burned it to the ground, along with significant portions of the surrounding community. The deliberate destruction of a manufacturing town as a military objective was controversial enough that Turchin was court-martialed for his conduct during the raid, though he was subsequently promoted by President Lincoln, which tells you something about how the military value of the destruction was ultimately assessed. Bell Factory never rebuilt. The mill that had organized the community was gone, and without it, there was nothing to rebuild around. The Flint River still runs through that part of Madison County. The mill and the community it anchored have been gone for over 160 years. Number 6. Coffeyville Landing, Alabama, Clark County. Before the railroads reorganized the commercial geography of Alabama, the Tombigbee River was one of the most important economic arteries in the state, and the landing communities that grew up along it operated at a level of commercial activity that their current invisibility makes almost impossible to believe. Coffeyville Landing in Clark County was one of those communities, a river port where cotton moved downstream toward Mobile in quantities that sustained hotels, warehouses, merchants, and the full supporting economy of a functioning antebellum landing. The steamboat era on the Tombigbee ended the way steamboat eras ended everywhere. The railroads arrived and offered faster, more reliable transportation that did not depend on river levels or seasonal conditions. The commercial logic that had built Coffeyville Landing simply transferred to wherever the nearest rail depot was, and the landing community that had been genuinely significant during the cotton economy's peak found itself without the traffic that had justified its existence. The Tombigbee still runs through Clark County. The Army Corps of Engineers eventually built a lock and dam system along the river that altered its character significantly. Coffeyville Landing, the community that existed before all of that, is gone in a way that the river itself does not reflect. The water moves through. The town that depended on it does not. Number 5. White Plains, Alabama, Calhoun County. White Plains in Calhoun County is one of the more genuinely strange ghost town stories in Alabama because the thing that killed it was not external. Not a railroad decision made elsewhere, not a flood, not a war. It was a shift in the town's own population, driven by forces that the community had no way to anticipate or resist. White Plains grew up in the antebellum period as a prosperous agricultural community in the hill country of northeastern Alabama, with a post office, several churches, a functioning commercial district, and the social infrastructure of a community that considered itself established. The post-war period hit the hill country communities of northeastern Alabama with a particular severity. The agricultural economy that had sustained places like White Plains collapsed and did not recover in the way that wealthier Black Belt communities eventually managed. Outmigration from the region accelerated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries as younger residents made the calculation that their futures were better served by the industrial cities of the north and the growing Alabama urban centers than by the struggling hill country farms their parents had worked. Each departure made the community slightly less viable. The school enrollment dropped. The churches consolidated. The merchants who remained found their customer base shrinking year by year until the commercial logic of staying evaporated. White Plains did not end dramatically. It drained. And the draining took long enough that nobody could point to the moment it became a ghost town because there was no single moment. There was just the gradual, inexorable math of a community losing people faster than it could replace them. Number 4. Bluffport, Alabama, Choctaw County. Bluffport sat on a high bluff above the Tombigbee River in Choctaw County, and for a period in the early 19th century, it was one of the most promising communities in the entire southwestern part of the state. The bluff gave it a geographic advantage that river towns at lower elevations envied. It was above the floodline, visible from the river, and positioned to serve the commercial traffic moving along the Tombigbee in a way that lower-lying competitors could not always guarantee. Merchants recognized the location. Professional men built offices there. The commercial infrastructure of a genuine Alabama river town took shape on that bluff with speed that reflected genuine optimism about what the place was going to become. The optimism was not wrong about the location. It was wrong about the railroad. When the Mobile and Ohio Railroad laid its route through Choctaw County, it did not come near Bluffport. The railroad went to Shibuda and other points that connected to the main commercial corridors the railroad was building, and Bluffport found itself sitting on its excellent bluff with no rail connection and no way to compete with communities that had one. The river traffic that had justified the location continued for a time, but the economics of competing without rail access against communities that had it were unwinnable. Bluffport declined steadily through the second half of the 19th century and was effectively gone as a functioning community by the early 20th. The bluff is still there above the Tombigbee. The town that its geography seemed to guarantee never materialized. Number 3. Bartonville, Alabama, Tuscaloosa County. Bartonville in Tuscaloosa County has the specific quality of a ghost town that was significant once in ways that its complete current invisibility refuses to suggest. This was a community with educational and religious institutions, with the kind of professional and commercial presence that characterized the more developed Alabama communities of the antebellum period, and with a population substantial enough to support the infrastructure it had built. It was not a marginal settlement clinging to a single economic function. It was a real town with real depth. What took Bartonville apart was the cumulative pressure of the post-war period applied to a community that had been built on an economic foundation, the plantation agriculture of antebellum Tuscaloosa County, that the war and its aftermath dismantled. The commercial relationships that had sustained the town's merchants depended on the cotton economy, operating at a scale that Reconstruction and the subsequent agricultural depression made impossible to maintain. The professional class that had given the community its depth found fewer reasons to remain as the economic activity that had supported them contracted. The educational institutions that had been a point of community pride struggled for funding and enrollment as the population declined. Bartonville did not disappear suddenly. It diminished over decades, each loss making the next one more likely, until the community crossed a threshold below which self-sustaining existence was no longer possible. What the war started, time finished. Almost nothing remains today to indicate that a community of genuine substance once operated in that part of Tuscaloosa County. Number 2. Mesopotamia, Alabama, Colbert County. The name alone tells you something about the ambition of the people who founded this community in what is now Colbert County in northwestern Alabama. They named it after the ancient cradle of civilization. They were not thinking small. Mesopotamia was established in the early 19th century along the Tennessee River with the kind of founding energy that believed geography and determination could build something lasting. The Tennessee River gave the community commercial access to a trade network that ran from the Appalachian Highlands to the Mississippi and beyond. The founding generation built accordingly. The Tennessee Valley was transformed more dramatically than almost any other part of Alabama by the arrival of the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s. The TVA's dam system along the Tennessee River created the series of reservoirs that reshaped the valley's hydrology, flooding some communities, transforming others, and reorganizing the economic geography of the entire region in ways that individual towns had no power to resist or redirect. Mesopotamia's position along the river that the TVA was re-engineering placed it in the path of changes that the founding generation, who had named it after an ancient civilization, could not possibly have anticipated. The community that had been built around the natural Tennessee River found itself on the wrong side of the engineered version. The ambitious name survives in historical records. The community it described does not.